The midday sun blazed down relentlessly, turning the palace courtyard into a basin of shimmering heat. Light bounced from the gilded gates and ceremonial ironwork, casting long, intricate shadows across the flagstones. Tourists, as they did every day, clustered behind rope barriers and along the fence lines, their phones raised like digital spears, eager to capture a moment, a symbol, a man. Among the sea of wide-eyed onlookers stood a single figure in crimson and black. Still as the statues flanking the gates, he bore the summer heat with silent stoicism. His uniform, immaculate. Buttons gleaming, belt tight, boots polished to a mirror shine. Beneath the tall bearskin hat and ceremonial garb stood not just a guard, but a man of unwavering discipline. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. He was known to his comrades as Blackwood. His presence was not merely one of appearance or pageantry. Behind the ceremonial posture stood a seasoned veteran, a man forged not in pomp, but in the unforgiving crucible of military conflict. Years of service under high-stakes conditions had etched into him a type of strength invisible to the casual observer, a strength that does not raise its voice, does not seek to be seen, but radiates from stillness, from restraint, from purpose. This was not simply a job. To Blackwood, the uniform he wore was sacred. Each morning, hours before the city stirred, he woke in silence and prepared with near ritualistic care. Every buckle aligned. Every crease sharp. Every detail accounted for. Not out of vanity, but out of reverence, for the position, for the past, for the ideals he stood to protect. The courtyard bustled with excitement. Families, school groups, couples on vacation. Laughter rippled through the crowd, camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, and children waved eagerly at the unflinching figures in red. Among them, however, was a different presence. He arrived with loud laughter, followed by a small entourage and the subtle gravity of wealth and entitlement. His clothes, crisp and branded. His movements, loose with the confidence of someone unused to being told no. His name was Kevin Reynolds, though it mattered little. What mattered was the way he moved, not with curiosity, but with conquest. The palace, to him, was not a historical monument or a place of tradition, it was a backdrop. A stage. A place to perform, fueled by alcohol and a desire to entertain. He swaggered toward Blackwood. He was already recording, or perhaps being recorded, as his friends followed close behind, cameras in hand. Their laughter had that sharp edge, where amusement bleeds into cruelty, where jest becomes intrusion. "Watch this," Reynolds said, not to Blackwood, but to his audience. The first antics were harmless, making faces beside the guard, waving a hand inches from his eyes, mimicking his stance. The crowd, half intrigued and half uncomfortable, parted to allow space for what they sensed was escalating. Tourists whispered, some turned away, others filmed on instinct. Blackwood remained still. His gaze fixed. He was trained for this, trained to absorb discomfort without response, to stand not for himself, but for something larger. In that moment, the silence of his posture was louder than any rebuke, but Reynolds, dissatisfied with his lack of reaction, pressed further. He stepped into Blackwood's personal space. Mockingly saluted, made crude comments about the uniform, the tradition, the very idea of standing still as a form of service. The performance intensified. The crowd's unease grew palpable. Some looked around for security, others quietly backed away. Then, it happened, a flash of motion. A split-second decision, spit. It caught the sunlight briefly before landing just beneath Blackwood's right eye. The crowd gasped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Cameras stopped recording. The weight of what had just occurred settled over the space like a sudden storm. Reynolds stood there, a smug half-smile on his face, waiting, perhaps for an outburst, perhaps for applause. But what he received was neither. Blackwood did not flinch. He did not break posture. He did not even blink. The saliva slid down his cheek like a tear, and he let it fall. The strength in that moment was not in retaliation, but in composure. Not in words, but in silence. It was a moment that would come to be replayed across devices and screens for days, then weeks, then months. But no pixel, no angle, could fully capture the thunderous quiet that followed. Security began to move. An officer's voice called out. The rhythm of approaching boots signaled the arrival of senior guards. But all eyes were still locked on Blackwood, and the man who had failed, to break him, with the silent command of discipline earned over a lifetime. Blackwood moved. One slow, deliberate turn. One crisp salute. And then, granted permission to speak, he did. His voice, calm and even, carried like a drumbeat across the courtyard. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a harsh golden light over the ceremonial square, where dozens of tourists gathered behind ornate barriers, their cameras raised in anticipation. They had come for the spectacle, the tradition. The brush with grandeur represented by men in red and black, whose stillness symbolized something ancient, something timeless. Among them stood a guard known as Blackwood, a man of precise stature, carved not merely by routine but by history, experience, and purpose. His uniform, pristine, was not simply fabric and form, but emblematic of something deeper, tradition, discipline, and the quiet resilience of duty. Blackwood was no stranger to hardship. Before he earned the right to wear the ceremonial garb, he had served in active combat, where stillness came not from ritual but from the need to survive, to protect, to lead. His mind carried memories of hot deserts, sharp commands, and the weight of responsibility far greater than his own safety. These experiences had honed in him a calm that went beyond practice. It had become part of his core. To him, the post he held in that square was no performance. It was an honor. A living tribute to those who had stood before him and the ideals they represented. Among the crowd that day, a figure stood out, not because of his reverence, but because of his disregard. He arrived with companions, dressed in expensive fabrics and cloaked in self-importance. His name was Kevin Reynolds, though in that moment, he might as well have been nameless. What defined him was not identity, but attitude. He viewed the moment not as a chance to witness something greater than himself, but as an opportunity to make himself the center of it. With a swaggering gait and a half-smirk that betrayed a lifetime of unchecked entitlement, he approached the stoic guard with a gleam in his eye and a phone in his hand. His voice rang out over the courtyard, exaggerated and performative. At first, it was the usual fare, mocking expressions, silly poses for the camera, childish attempts to break the unbreakable silence. His friends laughed behind their devices, capturing every second, eager for content. But while many laughed nervously, others watched in silence, their expressions tightening with discomfort. A child asked a parent why the man was being so mean. A vendor shook his head and slowly rolled his cart away. And still, Blackwood did not move. His stillness was not passivity, it was a kind of silent defiance. A message, unspoken but clear, "You will not shake me," yet Reynolds pressed on. Warnings came, quiet disapproval from nearby tourists, a disapproving shake of the head. A gentle voice asking him to stop, but they only seemed to feed his performance. He drew closer, his words louder, his gestures more invasive. He circled, taunted, jeered. The laughter of his companions grew thinner, more hesitant, as though even they began to sense a line being neared, if not yet crossed, and then, in an act as sudden as it was shocking, Reynolds crossed that line entirely. With a sneer, he spat. The saliva struck just below Blackwood's eye. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, as if the very air had been sucked from the square. No one moved. No one laughed. The act, so brazen and vile, had silenced even those who moments ago had encouraged it. The line between prank and profanity had been obliterated, and yet, in the face of this ultimate provocation, Blackwood did not move. The spittle ran down his cheek like a tear, but his eyes remained fixed forward, his body unshaken. What he displayed in that moment was not weakness, but the purest form of strength, a strength that does not require retaliation, does not seek vengeance, but stands tall and unyielding in the face of degradation. Moments later, the soft rhythm of boots approached. Authority had noticed. The patrol commander stepped into view. With a quiet command, the silence broke. "Guard. Stand down." Blackwood turned with the crisp precision of training, saluted, and waited. Then, for the first time since the encounter began, he spoke. What followed was not an outburst, not an angry tirade, but a message, calm, deliberate, and devastating in its truth. He wiped the spit from his face with a gloved hand, then addressed not just Reynolds, but the entire crowd. "Years ago, I took an oath. Not just to wear this uniform, but to uphold everything it stands for: discipline, honor, respect. While you spent your days searching for amusement, I was here, standing guard over a legacy far older and more meaningful than you seem capable of understanding." His words hung in the air, heavy and unwavering. "This," he said, motioning to his uniform, "is not a costume. It is a symbol. Before I earned the right to wear it, I stood in places where silence could mean survival, where discipline was the difference between life and death. I have buried friends who believed in these values, who died defending them. And here you are, mocking what you cannot comprehend." The man who had once strutted so confidently now stood pale and exposed. His companions said nothing. The crowd was still, captivated not by spectacle but by substance. "We endure the heat, the cold, the ridicule," Blackwood continued, "because we stand for something greater than ourselves. We are not here to be part of your entertainment. We are here to remind you that dignity does not bend under pressure. That strength is not about domination, but about restraint. You wanted to know if we're human. Yes. We are. And it is because we are human that we choose to rise above behavior like yours." There was no shouting, no dramatic pause. Just words. Powerful, steady, true. Reynolds tried to speak. But the weight of the moment rendered him silent. The guards moved in. Authorities explained the seriousness of the offense. His friends, once eager to film his antics, now held their devices low, unable to meet the gaze of those around them. The man who had sought a moment of internet glory now found himself the reluctant star of a very different kind of story. Footage of the event quickly spread, not because of its outrage, but because of its unexpected grace. People watched not to see a man break down, but to witness another stand tall. Around dinner tables, in classrooms, in newsrooms, the story was told and retold, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. The incident became more than just a confrontation. It became a reflection, a mirror held up to a world often too quick to mock, too slow to understand. Letters poured in from strangers who had never met the guard but felt compelled to thank him. Children wrote notes saying they had learned something about respect that day. Educators used it to spark discussions. Community leaders spoke of it as a modern parable of restraint and resolve. In time, the man who had spat would come to know the consequences. Legal processes took their course. Community service was ordered. And perhaps more meaningful than any sentence was the new awareness he carried, the inescapable realization of how his attempt to humiliate had only illuminated the very strength he tried to undermine. Blackwood, meanwhile, returned to his post the next day. He stood, as he always had, in silence. The same posture. The same discipline. But something had changed, not in him, but in the way people looked at him. Tourists still took pictures. Children still waved. But now, behind the camera lenses and casual smiles, there was something else: respect. They saw not just a man in a uniform, but a guardian of something deeply human, the choice to remain calm in chaos, to respond to insult with grace, to hold the line when dignity is challenged, and perhaps that is the lesson to be taken, not just from what was said, but from what was not. That real strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply stands. When finally given leave to speak, Blackwood's voice emerged with the calm authority of a man who had earned every syllable. There was no anger in his tone, no desire for retaliation. Only clarity. His words flowed with the steady cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning when to hold silence and when to let truth speak for itself. He spoke not just to Reynolds, but to everyone. To the crowd, the cameras, the future viewers who would later see the footage, he spoke to the moment itself. "We wear this uniform not to be admired," he began, his voice unwavering, "but to remind people of the values that built the foundations of dignity, discipline, duty, sacrifice. You do not need to understand it. But you are not free to diminish it." The air around him shifted. Tourists who had once laughed now stood solemn, their phones slowly lowering. Children clutched the hands of parents who themselves stood transfixed, their expressions thoughtful and reverent. Blackwood continued, his speech unbroken by emotion, yet weighted with feeling. "You see a man in a uniform and think it's just for show. But before we are posted here, we serve. We endure. We bleed. And some never come back. Every crease in this uniform, every polished button, every inch of standing still under sun or storm, is a silent tribute to those who can no longer stand." There was no dramatization. Only truth, measured, steady, precise. His words, forged through experience, stood in stark contrast to the shallow provocations that had preceded them. Reynolds, whose confidence had shriveled with each passing moment, looked down for the first time, as if only now realizing the depth of what he had done, not just to another man, but to an ideal. "You spat not on me," Blackwood concluded, "but on what I represent. And still, I stood. Because some things, the right things, should never be brought down to the level of disrespect." The silence that followed was complete. No one clapped. No one cheered. It was not that kind of moment. It was something deeper. Something sacred. The sort of silence that only follows truth when it has been laid bare. Reynolds was escorted away. His companions no longer holding up their phones. His sunglasses had fallen at some point and lay forgotten on the cobblestones. The moment he had so desperately tried to turn into content had instead become consequence, but it wasn't the arrest that would define what had taken place. It was the speech. It was the restraint. It was the man who, when given every reason to lash out, chose instead to educate. The footage spread quickly. Within hours, it had crossed borders, languages, ideologies. The commentary it sparked wasn't focused on the confrontation, but on the character. Some viewers called it a masterclass in restraint. Others said it was a reminder of what dignity looks like. More than one educator downloaded the video to use in upcoming lessons on values and behavior. Soldiers and veterans around the world recognized something in Blackwood's posture, the stillness of a man who has already faced far worse and carries that weight without complaint. Perhaps most powerful, however, were the responses from everyday people. Letters poured in. Messages flooded online platforms. Not to mock Reynolds, but to thank the man who showed what strength can look like when wrapped in silence and tempered by respect. One comment, widely shared, simply read, "He stood so we didn't have to shout." That's what leadership is. Blackwood, for his part, declined all media requests. He didn't see himself as a hero. In his view, he had only done what was right. When asked privately why he didn't react more forcefully, he replied, "Because if I had, the lesson would have been lost." Instead, the message remained intact, untouched by spectacle. Schools invited students to reflect on the meaning of his words. Discussions were held in workplaces about professional conduct and composure. Leadership seminars quoted him. Even public service institutions began incorporating the footage into training modules, pointing not to the moment of provocation, but to the unwavering resolve in the face of it. As for Reynolds, his name soon became associated with a cautionary tale. The legal system moved swiftly. Though the fine was substantial, it was the court-mandated service at veteran support centers that left the deepest mark. There, for the first time, he encountered stories far different from his own, a man rebuilding his life after injury, a widow speaking softly about her partner's final deployment, a group of former soldiers laughing not about war, but about friendship and memory. As slowly, perhaps even painfully, Reynolds began to understand. Not just what he had done, but what he had missed. It was not about ceremony. It was about service. It was not about pride. It was about purpose. He never again sought attention in the same way. And though many would not forgive his actions, they would also come to see him differently, not because he had changed overnight, but because he had been changed by the very values he had once mocked. Meanwhile, Blackwood continued as he always had. The next morning, before the city stirred, he rose and prepared his uniform with the same quiet devotion. When he stepped once more into his position beneath the palace gates, the crowd gathered just as before. But now, something had shifted, not in him, but in them. They watched not with expectation, but with appreciation. Children asked their parents why the guard stood so still. And this time, the answers were different, because some people stand for something more than themselves, because discipline is strength, because silence, when chosen with purpose, can speak louder than any scream. The footage from that summer afternoon spread across the internet at an astonishing pace, but not in the way Kevin Reynolds had hoped. What he intended as a moment of ridicule, a viral stunt to provoke amusement or admiration among his followers, swiftly transformed into something far beyond his control. The clips, captured from multiple angles, each showing the same act of provocation, the same act of disrespect, and finally, the same act of composure, became a collective mirror held up to society. Millions watched as a man in ceremonial dress stood unmoved while being spit on. But more than that, they listened to what was said afterward. The speech, calm and composed, that did not condemn with anger but illuminated with clarity. Social media platforms erupted not in laughter, but in reverence. Comments flooded in, "This is what real strength looks like. Teach this in schools." A masterclass in self-control. The uniform didn't make him dignified, he brought dignity to the uniform. News agencies picked up the story quickly, but unlike the typical tabloid cycle of scandal and outrage, this story became something else, a cultural moment. Interviews were requested. Op-eds were written. Analysts, ethicists, veterans, and educators weighed in. Many saw it not as a viral sensation, but as a much-needed reminder of what it means to carry oneself with honor in a time when disrespect is often excused in the name of entertainment or just having fun. And at the center of it all stood Blackwood, unchanged, unfazed, unwilling to claim a pedestal he never sought. He declined interviews, deflected praise, and returned to his post the next day with the same stillness, the same precision, the same quiet strength. As for Reynolds, the aftermath unfolded with sharp clarity. His identity was quickly confirmed. The internet, as quick to elevate as it is to dismantle, turned its focus to him, not with admiration, but with scrutiny. His online presence, once curated and polished, was now flooded with responses questioning his character, his behavior, his understanding of respect. Profiles were deactivated. Public relations teams scrambled. But the damage was already done. More impactful than the public fallout, however, were the legal consequences. The local judicial system viewed the act not as a harmless prank, but as an assault on a person in official service, a symbol of institutional dignity. The charges included public misconduct, harassment, and assault. During the court proceedings, a judge spoke with measured gravity. This was not simply an act of disrespect toward a person. It was an insult to the principles that person represented: duty, honor, and restraint. And this court will not treat those values as disposable. The penalty was more than financial. Though Reynolds was issued a fine substantial enough to draw headlines, the more impactful ruling was a mandated term of community service at veteran support organizations. For a man who had once mocked uniformed service from a place of ignorance, the sentence would prove to be a mirror held to his own shortcomings. At first, the community service was awkward, even resented. But over time, something began to change. Listening to wounded veterans speak not of glory but of loss, seeing how their eyes lit up when they spoke of their units, their camaraderie, their fallen brothers, something within Reynolds began to crack, then shift. He stopped showing up out of obligation and began asking questions. He stayed after hours. He listened. He learned, no redemption is instant. But transformation can begin in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, the video continued to circulate, not as a spectacle, but as a civic parable. It found its way into schools, military academies, even corporate seminars on leadership and professional conduct. Educators posed questions to students. What does it mean to stay composed under pressure? When does silence speak louder than speech? In homes and classrooms around the world, the story became a jumping-off point for discussions on values that often get lost in the noise of modern life. Letters continued to arrive at the palace. Some from children. Some from veterans. Some from ordinary people who simply wanted to say thank you. One message, handwritten and folded into an envelope lined with crayon drawings, read, "Dear Guard Blackwood, I want to be like you when I grow up. Not because you were still, but because you were kind." Not long after, a quiet change took place on the palace grounds. Visitors still gathered daily. They still snapped photos. Children still waved. But now, there was something else. A tone. A hush. A collective awareness that those standing in uniform were not props, but people, carrying history, embodying values, and doing so without the need for applause. In one corner of the square, near a discreet garden wall, a small bronze plaque was eventually installed. It bore no names. Only words, "True strength does not rise to insult, it stands in its presence and remains unshaken." The incident, simple in form yet profound in its consequences, echoed far beyond the cobblestones of the palace square. What had begun as a moment of thoughtless provocation transformed, almost instantly, into something larger, something enduring. In classrooms and households, office break rooms and community centers, people began asking questions they hadn't paused to consider in years. What does it mean to serve something greater than yourself? What does respect look like when it's not demanded, but demonstrated? What kind of strength chooses silence over retaliation? Educators across a wide range of communities seized the opportunity. In one school, students were asked to write about a time they had remained calm when provoked. In another, a history teacher paired the viral video with lessons on ceremonial traditions and why they persist. Children, often shielded from the complexities of human behavior, were gently introduced to a more nuanced understanding, that discipline is not stiffness, and that dignity, though quiet, is immensely powerful. Parents, too, found language in the event. Around dinner tables, they shared the video not for shock, but for insight. They asked their children not just what they thought of Blackwood's speech, but how they would have reacted in his place. Some used the moment to explore what it meant to apologize, to recognize wrong, to value humility. What emerged wasn't a debate, but a conversation, something more honest than outrage, something more lasting than headlines. Civic institutions picked up the thread. Training centers for public service, armed forces, and emergency responders integrated the footage and transcript into workshops and discussions. Not because of the conflict, but because of the composure. Blackwood became a case study in emotional control, ethical professionalism, and the way one individual's restraint could carry the weight of centuries. It was not just about responding to disrespect. It was about embodying what you stand for. Even when tested, public figures spoke up, veterans, officials, philosophers. Not in grand gestures, but in sincere admiration. One retired officer remarked, "It wasn't just how he stood still. It was why." That's what people are responding to. That's what we've forgotten in all the noise, that sometimes real power lies in doing nothing, at exactly the right moment. And through all of this, Blackwood remained unchanged. He returned to duty the following morning, as he always had. Long before sunrise, he rose in silence. He ironed each fold, polished each brass detail, and dressed not for the eyes of the world, but for the quiet code he had always honored. As he stepped into position under the early light, there were no crowds yet. Just the sound of morning traffic, the flutter of flags overhead, the weight of time settling over the square like a familiar coat. Tourists still came, of course. They still lifted their phones, still marveled at the uniforms, still pointed out the pageantry. But now, woven into their behavior was a thread of reverence. Many stood just a little farther back. A few removed their hats. Children were heard asking not, "Can we make them laugh?" but "Do they ever get tired?" And parents answered carefully, mindful that they were no longer just visitors to a monument, but witnesses to a symbol. Blackwood noticed, though he said nothing. That was never his style. But he felt it. The quiet respect. The shifted tone. The occasional nod from an older visitor. The soft-spoken thank you from a child. And he carried it with him, not as a burden, but as a reaffirmation, that restraint is not weakness, and that silence, chosen consciously, is a language of strength. Reynolds' story faded from public memory faster than he expected. Social media, fickle in its loyalty, moved on. The headlines gave way to new ones. Yet in the places that mattered, in memory, in conversation, in the quiet resolve of those who watched and understood, Blackwood's stance endured. He didn't win a medal. He didn't give interviews. There was no formal ceremony, no grand gesture of recognition. And yet, what he achieved surpassed those fleeting honors. He became, in the minds of many, a living reminder of something essential, that tradition is not the enemy of progress. That service is not about power, but humility. That real strength doesn't rise in anger, but stands firm in purpose. Years from now, the moment may still be played in classrooms. The speech may still be quoted in leadership seminars. And the image of a solitary guard, unmoving under insult, may still stir something deep in the human spirit. Because some stories don't just fade. They resonate, and every time Blackwood resumes his post, adjusting his stance beneath the weight of history, he reminds the world, without ever needing to say a word, that dignity does not demand applause, it simply endures. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.